want to take this down to the community. Saya cuma mengambil structure meeting.
Morning, Oli. Good afternoon, Nanette. I hope you're feeling better.
Hello, Charles. Thank you. Yes, feeling better.
Good.
Thank
We'll formally start in a few minutes.
Good.
Hey, Emanuele.
Just wanted to test the mic.
It's perfectly okay.
Fantastic, because I had some problems lately. Very happy to be with you all and looking forward to this fantastic panel.
Likewise, thanks.
And thanks, Charles Antoine, for organizing it and bringing us all together.
It's a pleasure, as always.
Hi, good morning, Charles Antoine. Hi, good morning, colleagues. Hope everything is well, and I hope you can see me and hear me loud and clear.
We can both see you and hear you loud and clear. Good morning, Mervat.
Perfect, thank you. Thanks a lot.
We'll start in a few minutes. Hi, Kristen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning, Director NDMO Fiji.
Bolovanak, everybody. Good morning. This is Vasiti, Director, NDMO Fiji.
Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to have you with us.
Sorry, I was supposed to say good evening. I got caught up with someone saying good morning. It's good evening too in Fiji. Sorry.
Indeed. I hope it's not too late for you.
West Africa, so I think we've got the, more than half the world here.
So colleagues, we'll wait another 2 minutes starting So I think we can start. I can see a few more participants joining, but let's be respectful for everyone. Let's start on time. So I would like to welcome everyone to this high-level panel on accountability to affected populations. I'm Charles-Antoine Hoffman, working with UNICEF, but here in my capacity of supporting the work of the IASC Results Group on Accountability and Inclusion. I will just go briefly through very practical things before handing over to Mervat. We are recording the session. I hope it's all right with everyone, but that's important. We want to make sure that we make it available for those who cannot attend. So that's just for your information. Please mute yourself. We are quite a large number of participants, so having background noises can be distressful. So let's be disciplined with this. And also we suggest to those who are not speaking to turn the video off, as I can see you doing already. And obviously, please feel free to turn it on when you intervene. We will be monitoring the chat box for questions, comments, etc. So please use it. And if you want to take the floor when there will be space for discussions or questions, indicate if you want to speak. We want this session to be as lively as possible. And without further ado, let me introduce MervatShelbaya, who is going to be the session facilitator. And I'm very pleased that Mervat accepted to do that. You'll be definitely in very good hands. Mervat is the head of the Interagency Standing Committee Secretariat, appointed by the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and the Emergency Relief Coordinator. And in this role, Mervat is playing a critical function in terms of supporting both UN and non-UN humanitarian partners in terms of operational, policy, and advocacy issues in support of strengthening humanitarian action at field or country level. Mervat is also the director of OCHA's Interagency Support Branch, which is the branch providing support to humanitarian coordinators so that we can ensure that the humanitarian operations are led as it should be. And Mervat has over 20 years of experience in humanitarian affairs, both at global and field levels. And let me straight hand over to you, Mervat. Back to you.
Brilliant. Many thanks, Charles-Antoine. Good morning to you. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to colleagues online. Welcome, of course, to this really, really important session, this discussion on delivering on our accountability to affected people, delivering on our AAP commitments. And this is really an opportunity to look at lessons learned and look at good practices in addressing barriers to AAP within the system. I'm truly honored to be moderating this session, and I'm really pleased that we are joined today by a great panel to kickstart this discussion, but also share important findings and the respective experiences on the barriers to collective AAP, but also on the opportunities for us to make a step change in translating our AAP commitments and aspirations to meaningful action and change. Mr. Oliver Lough is a research fellow at the Humanitarian Policy Group with ODI, with a background in needs assessment and monitoring and evaluation. His research interests are focused on humanitarian accountability, communicating with crisis-affected populations, and evidence-based decision-making processes in emergencies. Today, Oliver will have the opportunity to speak to us about some of the key findings and recommendations from a recently published report. I believe it was published October 2020, titled Implementing Collective Accountability to Affected Populations, Ways Forward in Large-Scale Humanitarian Crises. Welcome, Oliver. We're also joined by Ms. Vasiti Soko. Welcome, Vasiti. Vasiti is the director of Fiji's National Disaster Management Office. She is a champion of inclusivity and also co-chairs the Pacific Technical Working Group on Human Mobility and the Pacific Response to the Disaster Displacement Advisory Board. Vasiti also serves as Deputy Chair for Asia Pacific TWG on disaster-related statistics, and she has more than 15 years of experience in geospatial science. Welcome again, Vasiti. Really honored that you were able to join us. We're also joined today by Ms. REGINA Nanette SALVADOR-ANTEQUISA. She is the founding Executive Director of Ecosystems Work for Essential Benefits, ECOWEB for short. This is a national development and humanitarian organization based in the Philippines. Nanette has over 30 years of experience in peace, development, and humanitarian work in the Philippines, and she is the convener of the community-led Emergency Action Response Network, ClearNet, and a national representative of the Victims and Disaster and Calamity Sector to the government's National Anti-Poverty Commission. Again, welcome, Nanette, to today's session, and we look forward to your interventions. We also have with us today Mr. Emanuele Copobianco. Emanuele is the Director of Health and Care at the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, IFRC. He leads IFRC's Global Health and Care team, which provides strategic and operational support to 192 national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. He also leads IFRC's technical response to COVID-19 and has been the emergency coordinator for the Ebola outbreaks in DRC. Previously, he also had the opportunity to work with the Global Fund, the World Bank, UNICEF, and WHO. Welcome, Emanuele. I'm glad you could join us today. And last but definitely not least, I'm really pleased that we are joined today by Ms. Kristen Knudsen. Kristen is the head of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA. She's the head of the Office of OCHA in Burkina Faso. She has nearly 20 years of experience with the United Nations in the field of humanitarian affairs and has held various positions with OCHA in the Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Haiti, and Uganda, as well as UN headquarters in New York. Welcome, Kristen, and welcome to all of our panelists, and really, really look forward to today's discussions and your interventions. Now, colleagues, this is an important and exciting time to be engaging in discussions and considering ways to strengthen our collective accountability to the millions of the most vulnerable around the world that we are here to serve. But as we do so, it is really important to acknowledge the extraordinary efforts undertaken in recent years, including from many of you here at this forum and many of those who joined us today, to ensure communities are indeed at the center of humanitarian action. Since the launch of the Grand Bargains Participation Revolution at the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, 5 years ago now, we've moved a long way in acting upon our commitments to affected people so that the system is held to account by the people we work to serve, assist, and protect. In addition to the critical work done by yourselves and the various organizations and stakeholders around the world, at the Interagency Standing Committee, there is renewed drive, effort, and commitment to build the necessary blocks to strengthen the system's collective accountability to affected people. And I'll speak to some of the critical work being done under the auspices or the umbrella of the IASC later on in the session. If I may ask, I believe someone has their phone unmuted, and so there's a little bit of an echo that I can hear myself. So if colleagues can just be reminded to please mute their phones, that would be excellent. So, but again, as clearly outlined in recent surveys with affected people and also the ODI report, which Oliver will speak to shortly, clearly there's a lot more that needs to be done to strengthen our collective ability to better listen and respond to affected people, safeguard their dignity, and ensure their meaningful engagement in decisions that directly affect them. So critical attention and momentum is being built to effect the required shifts, including some of you may have seen the recent call from the Emergency Relief Coordinator, who is, again, the chair of the Interagency Standing Committee and also the Undersecretary General for the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the recent call, which he announced yesterday, for the creation of an independent commission into Voices in Crisis, which seeks to ensure or look at systematic and transparent and public assessment and evaluation of our collective ability to indeed respond to the needs of the most vulnerable in the most efficient way. We must build on and capitalize on this unique attention and momentum. And that's why I'm extremely pleased and excited about today's session to build upon the great work that's been done over the course of the past years to make sure that we continue to strengthen our collective response and accountability to affected people. Perhaps with that, I'd like to turn to our panelists, starting with Oliver. Oliver, as mentioned earlier, again, thank you for joining us, and it would be great to kickstart today's panel discussion by sharing some of the key lessons and findings from the ODI report, which was published a few months ago on collective AAP approaches. So perhaps with that, over to you, please, Oliver.
Thank you very much, Mervat. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to be able to share the findings of our research with you. I believe Marcella has some slides that will accompany this presentation, so if she would be able to share the screen, that is fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay, next slide, please. So I'd like to just start by going over the work that we did on this research project that is looking specifically at the idea of collective approaches to community engagement and accountability in humanitarian action. And we did this in 2019 and 2020 at a time when collective approaches had been used kind of increasingly throughout the humanitarian system since the early 2010s, but hadn't quite yet bedded down in a sort of systematic way across the system. So we wanted to look at what the bottlenecks were around this and look at what the opportunities were for sort of more systematic and predictable implementation of these approaches. So we did 5 case studies that kind of aimed to look at how approaches were happening in a range of different contexts. So these are all on our website, but just very briefly, we looked at protracted conflict settings in CAR and Yemen. We looked at natural hazard-related disasters in the Mozambique Idai response and the Indonesia Sulawesi earthquake, and we looked at a complex public health emergency in the DRC Ebola crisis. Next slide, please. So just to start off, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we mean when we're talking about a collective approach to communication and community engagement, and I'll use communication and community engagement interchangeably with AAP. Please understand it to mean the same thing. So this is our understanding of what a collective approach should look like, and it's based on previous research and guidance, but also what we were seeing in practice. And the key thing to sort of take into account here is that it's something that cuts across and is owned by the entire response. It ideally involves a multiple range of actors, from sort of senior UN leadership down to affected communities themselves and ideally host governments. And it's sort of involves multiple mechanisms, so ways to collect feedback, ways to speak to affected communities, and it's focused on really improving the way responses as a whole strengthen two-way communication with affected communities. So providing information, getting information, closing the feedback loops, and ultimately this is with the aim of kind of shifting the dial on the response, making responses more responsive and accountable to the needs of the people they're serving. And it's really important to acknowledge that these mechanisms don't exist separately from individual agency or program accountability systems. The idea is that they sort of build on them and pull them together and work in a complementary way with them. In terms of why it's important to do things collectively as well as just at the individual agency level, there's a couple of key reasons. First of all, it improves the efficiency and the effectiveness of a response. So it's a way to make complementary use of the strengths and coverage of different agencies. It can minimize and identify gaps. It can make things more efficient. It can kind of lower the barrier to entry for potentially quite expensive ways of talking to and addressing community needs. And it can give the response as a whole a more comprehensive understanding of kind of cross-cutting needs of the community. But it's also a really important way to make responses more coherent and more legible to affected people themselves. So, for example, it's a way to make feedback systems much more easy to navigate by streamlining them and sort of making them, centralized. It's a way to make sure that messaging gets to the right people in the right language in ways that are culturally appropriate and have been properly tested. Ideally, it's a way of making sure that people, including those who are most marginalized and vulnerable, can also have multiple entry points to provide feedback and complain to the system. And finally, it's a really important way to allow people to engage humanitarians around what's important to them, rather than sort of within silos or programming. So, you know, people being able to talk about their needs rather than just being able to talk to food security people about food or shelter people about shelter and so on. Next slide, please. So one of the key things that we found is right now that there is still an implementation gap in terms of how collective approaches are sort of being thought of in policy and guidance and what's happening on the ground, which is still kind of quite patchy and quite unpredictable. And we found a number of key reasons for this, and I'll take you through the main ones now. So the first thing to note is that there is still a lack of common understanding, both around accountability, AAP in general, and collective approaches specifically. And in terms of the accountability stuff in general, like while this can just be a question of semantics, it can also really result in sort of parallel structures and people working at cross purposes. And kind of the most extreme example in DRC and elsewhere is sort of accountability to affected populations, communities, and humanitarian work, and risk communication communities and public health work kind of occasionally working at cross purposes and sort of leading to more confusion rather than coherence. And in terms of collectives, what we found is that a lot of people weren't really clear about kind of what a collective approach was meant to look like or do, and that there was quite a lot of focus on common services as being a collective approach. So sort of, you know, running a common hotline and calling it a day, which is good, but it is quite narrow in terms of the definition we've talked about of kind of trying to involve the response and trying to involve multiple mechanisms. Another really key issue that we found was a lack of senior level buy-in and commitment to collective approaches. And as one of our informants said, this is really important because top-down commitments are a way to enable bottom-up feedback to move through the system. So we found that humanitarian coordinators and country teams weren't always clear on kind of what a collective approach was meant to be and sort of what their or other people's responsibilities were around it. And this kind of has a knock-on effect on how effective collective approaches can be. So without a clear guidance on sort of who's meant to be facilitating the approach, kind of what it's meant to be focusing on, and what the strategy is, you can end up with bits and pieces of common services that don't kind of really come together into a coherent whole, and that there's no one really mandated to identify where there are gaps or what's missing. So the whole can end up less than the sum of its parts. But another real problem here is you can also have collective approaches that are kind of siloed down into a technical forum with a sort of a narrow range of actors working on them, generating a lot of really rich information and feedback, but they don't have a way to connect to kind of important decision-making processes that can move the dial on the response. And that sort of results in feedback loops not being closed. So there's a need for more kind of legitimate spaces for thinking about and acting on information that these collective approaches generate in a way that plugs into high-level decision-making processes. Money is also a problem, and specifically not having enough of the right kind of money. So kind of reflecting the lack of common understandings around collective approaches in general, we found quite a fragmented donor landscape. So different donors having different understandings and different priorities and funding bits and pieces here and there, but kind of nothing coherent on how to fund a collective approach in the way, for example, donors kind of have got together on cash. Collective approaches are also quite cheap, as we'll talk about in a second, which means they're quite fiddly to fund directly. And that this can result in ways of funding that kind of concentrate power in a small number of hands, and you can have and end up with the sort of the same big agency coordinating, implementing, and subgranting an approach. And this can lead to approaches that sort of have the form of a collective, but actually don't sort of foster the sort of collaborative spirit that's needed to really make them work. And a final point on funding is quite often these things are still funded not at scale and on sort of short-term pilot basis, which is a big problem as it takes time to sort of build legitimacy, to build relationships and to begin to influence the response. And having these set up as pilots sort of sets them up for failure. And a final, and arguably the most important one that is not unique to collective approaches is a lack of local ownership and local leadership in collective approaches. And what we found was that there's a tendency for the way in which collectives are facilitated at the moment to have them quite deeply embedded within the technocratic humanitarian coordination architecture. They tend to be owned and dominated by UN agencies or big INGOs. And we didn't really see any examples of collectives in internationally led responses having a really strong presence of local actors. This means that there are a lot of local actors who have, strong networks and long relationships on the ground that are either excluded from the coordination system or don't see the value in plugging in, or the coordination system doesn't see the value in what they're doing because it doesn't quite conform to the jargon or the idea of what community engagement should look like. And the value of their work often goes unrecognized. There are good examples of this happening in preparedness settings where there hasn't been an emergency yet. So I'm sure our colleagues in Fiji will speak to this, but there's been work done by the CDAC network on sort of strengthening collective approaches for preparedness. But there does seem to be kind of a broken link between approaches that are launched during an emergency and being able to sort of sustain them through into the preparedness phase. And that's a really important one, because if you can do a lot of this stuff before an emergency happens, you're not then having to play catch up in the first 2 months of emergency, setting up all of your systems and building all of your relationships. Next slide, please. So despite these blockages, there is quite a strong potential enabling environment to take collective approaches forward. So there is a perception widespread among the people we talk to that a collective approach makes sense and is a necessary addition. Even if people weren't kind of familiar with the idea, it's something that people generally intuitively get, and there wasn't a lot of pushback on it. We also did a quick cost analysis, and to the extent that collective approaches incur specific costs rather than sort of being mainstreamed across agency program budgets, they are pretty cheap, and we found that they generally come in at well under 1% of the cost of a humanitarian response plan when they're budgeted for. So in terms of kind of what they can offer a response, this is pretty cheap. There's also just a kind of a general background, an increasing background buzz around collective approaches. So there's like a lot of strong policy and guidance. CDAC Network have done a huge amount of work on this. There's our research. We're really excited about IASC's Results Group 2 on the accountability framework that they're working on, which can hopefully provide kind of more tangible building blocks for approaches for senior leadership. There's also a lot of really strong specialist organizations that have become increasingly prominent in recent years that are working on these things and can provide these key common services, so sort of like Translators Without Borders and language, for example. And there is a strong policy framework. So our collective approach has been in humanitarian country team TORs since 2017. And it's built on increasingly strong commitments across the sector to accountability more widely. And, as Mervat mentioned, it's in the grand bargain, it's in the reform agenda, and we'll be really interested to see how this goes in whatever comes after the grand bargain. Next slide, please. So I'd just like to conclude on where we can possibly go next. And the key starting point that we want to emphasize in our recommendations is collective approaches are going to look different in different places, depending on the needs of the crisis, the actors involved, the different capabilities, kind of how people are aligned. And so we wanted to try and build our recommendations around kind of the principles that you need to make a collective approach effective, regardless of the specific form or model that it takes. And one warning here is that kind of over-architecturing a collective approach and kind of trying to over-design it at the start can kind of result in it collapsing under its own weight before it really gets started. So kind of the key thing is to get moving on it as quickly as possible. So the principles we're looking at are that obviously leadership needs to commit strongly and commit early, and approaches will continue to be ad hoc and unpredictable if this doesn't happen. So start with a strong commitment, build out from there. They also need to have a really clear link with decision-making forums, and ideally they need to not kind of create yet another parallel structure, but build on what's already there. So how can this kind of be mainstreamed into the work of the HCT, be mainstreamed into the work of an assessment working group or other relevant forums. It also really needs to build on and complement the accountability mechanisms of individual agencies. If there's a strong existing network of actors on the ground, consider how you can bring their inputs into a feedback mechanism. If there's a really good hotline, how can that be expanded to the response? So, thinking about strengthening and kind of coordinating what's already there rather than necessarily having kind of a flashy new system and a flashy new dashboard. This can also be a good way of identifying where there are genuine gaps that do need new activities. Who facilitates a collective approach is also really important. So quite often these things end up being facilitated by people with really strong technical skills, but who don't necessarily have the political skills to make sure that information is well analyzed and it feeds into decision making in a way that it's acted upon. So both technical skills and political savvy are needed, and a perception of neutrality. So it can't just be seen to be sort of one representing one agency or one group within the response. This is really important because another thing that comes out is that a collective approach, and it really needs to be owned by the response. Everyone needs to see it as something that they can buy into and contribute to, and is part of the landscape, rather than like, oh, that's OCHA's thing, or that's the community engagements working groups thing. It's not our problem, because that kind of results in you know, a lack of things to feed into it and a lack of buy-in to the information it's providing. It's also critical that there is a much stronger element of local leadership and local engagement. So people facilitating these approaches need to find potentially creative ways to bring local knowledge into the discussion, especially if it's hard or exclusionary. And ideally, especially in natural hazard related settings, like this really should be part of you know, national disaster management processes. This is going to be harder in conflict settings, obviously, when governments are either the perpetrator or are you know, not particularly accountable or transparent to their own populations, but there's still a need to think about how these collective approaches link to governments. And finally, the approach needs to be contextually relevant and inclusive. So it needs to be able to not just kind of helicopter a system in, but make sure that it is actually responding to what's on the ground. So especially in conflict contexts, the need to be sort of aware of what actors exist, who you're engaging with, and to be conflict sensitive. And finally, to make sure that the collective is inclusive, and that if you're building feedback systems for the response or building complaints mechanisms for the response, that they have entry points for the most vulnerable. So making sure that women and girls are included effectively, that people with disabilities are included effectively, and this is again often a main gap. I'll leave it there as I think I'm out of time. The last thing I wanted to flag is one thing that we didn't see, and I'll be really interested to see where the discussion on this is really strong evidence of affected populations being directly involved in these approaches and actually being able to directly have a say in forums. So we see these collective approaches as really important to make responses more responsive, but in terms of that direct participation and that handing over the power, it's potentially more of a bridging point, and that needs to happen with other things involved. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Oliver, and thanks for concluding. Although, as mentioned, there wasn't really a deep analysis with regards to the extent to which affected communities or affected people are meaningfully engaging in decisions and around preparedness and response efforts by the system. So thank you for highlighting this critical point. But you've covered quite a lot of issues. So thank you for walking us through the critical barriers that you've seen through your research, again, including around barriers with regards to a shared understanding of what collective AAP means. You mentioned the importance of the buy-in and commitment of leadership, both globally, but also importantly at the field and operational level, and not only the humanitarian coordinators, but also the leadership of the humanitarian country team and key stakeholders on the ground. That's absolutely critical. The importance of localization, and thank you for highlighting this, because I always believe that without AAP and without appropriate engagement of local actors, we'll always struggle in terms of addressing effectively and efficiently the needs of communities, vulnerable communities on the ground. And last but not least is the issue of funding, dedicated funding, sustained funding, and the role of donors to make sure that we move the pendulum around our commitment to AAP. And thank you also for highlighting the fact that there's a lot. We already have the ingredients for success, and you walked us also through some ideas to address these barriers and capitalize on the infrastructure, I would say, that we have in place to make sure that we are much more accountable collectively to affected people. And I hear you loud and clear in terms of capitalizing on what we already have in place, rather than building new processes or systems that may be cumbersome and may not serve the purpose that we're all aiming for. So maybe with that, I'd like to actually turn to Vasiti. Once again, Vasiti is the director of the NDMO in Fiji. Vasiti, thank you so much again for joining us today. So Vasiti, so despite our localization commitments, and Oliver just again spoke to this issue as again one of the 4 barriers to our collective AAP commitments, the ODI study finds that, quote, local actors and governments are rarely considered in the design of collective approaches. So Vasiti, it would be really great in this case for you to share your experiences from Fiji, and where do you see the role of the government when it comes to AAP and our collective role to be more accountable to affected people. So over to you, please, Vasiti.
Thank you very much, moderator. For my update this evening, I'll start off by the cycle of disaster management and how the government actually does that approach. So from the mitigation side of disaster management cycle, the Fijian government, through our partners, and these are NGOs as well as civil society organizations, we conduct community-based disaster risk training across selected vulnerable communities in Fiji. These are communities that have been exposed to multiple cyclones, flooding, as well as landslide. So using our network and our partners, we conduct what we call a CBDRM training. So in that phase of mitigation, through that training, we develop what we call an emergency committee within the very own committee, or within the very own village or community. So the emergency committee, in the event of being trained, they are also being equipped with equipment that would allow them to mobilize early response should an event happen within the area of concern. So for mitigation, that's an area that the Fiji government is focusing on. In addition to that, we're looking at developing a disaster volunteer scheme in collaboration, again, with our close partners, to ensure that we not only address the needs of volunteers that support us during response, but also address those that support us during such training, as I just mentioned. For preparation, the Fijian government, through the support of partners again and respective ministries, we hold what we call a National Disaster Awareness Week, where we disseminate information to areas that have been vulnerable. Prior to the cyclone season, we conduct an operational readiness check across all ministries to ensure that assets, government assets, are ready for deployment in an event of imminent threat. And for the same reason, we also do media, media talks. We send out media pamphlets, etc., to the communities to inform them, in this case, of an upcoming cyclone season. So for this for the current cyclone season that we're in, we had gone out and do a very big media approach, talking to the public about the importance of preparedness. And this includes, simple things like putting extra nails to your roof to ensure that it's not blown away, putting extra strapping to ensure that your house is not affected, etc. So this information was not only pushed out to different media platforms, but also through our emergency structure, which allows the government to reach the community using our machinery. Informations were disseminated. Again, the Fiji government emergency structure, which gives the divisional commissioners the upper hand to mobilize response in an event of a disaster, reaching the community much faster than the national level. So this emergency structure over the years have proven to be very successful. So that is with regards to response. And when it comes to recovery, we normally do what we call an after-action review or post-cyclone recovery, where we collect or we speak to all our partners, including private sector, and we deliberate on what didn't go well. One of the lessons learned that we've brought from the recent disaster was how can we bring our NGOs and our private sector to be part of a response. So for TCIASA, we did we called out for NDMO certified partners, where we opened the doors to our all interested practitioners who wish to join government and reach out to the community to distribute or to attend to response. So in this after action review, we are also through the process. We are now also reviewing our legal framework, our National Disaster Management Act. So the Act, as part of the current review, looks into inclusivity, looks into accessibility in the evacuation center, also takes into account the different response and the different mechanisms that the government needs to play, including the private sector, which is becoming very prominent in our daily discussions. So within the disaster management cycle, those are just a few things that we do. Building on, and since this is specifically the forum for community-based, or the focus is on the people, we also are currently developing our CBDRM policy. In that policy, when we do training in the community, we have a training manual. So this training manual will continue to change as per the environment or as per the context of disaster change. So this just a nutshell of the government response to disaster management here in Fiji. Thank you.
Much appreciated, Vasiti. Thank you so much. And again, for speaking about the critical role that national disaster and management authorities on the ground, the critical role that they play in leading and coordinating preparedness and response efforts on the ground. And again, thanks so much for highlighting the work that you do in terms of communicating with possibly affected communities prior to a disaster to make sure that we minimize loss of life and suffering, the critical work that you play in coordinating efforts of NGOs and the private sector, because there's a wealth of knowledge and expertise within communities, within countries, and to ensure a more robust response, building on again these technical skills, capacities, and resources that other stakeholders offer. And again, it speaks to again the critical work and the importance of local knowledge and understanding of the specific needs of affected people. And that's why, again, the specific examples that you've mentioned around how you communicate with affected people, better understanding their specific needs depending on context, and that's the point that also came out in the ODI report. AAP, it really is very context specific. This again is clearly quite important and critical to make sure that we have a robust and tailored response that is inclusive of affected people. So thank you so much again, Vasiti, for your points, and I'm sure we are going to come back to you again with questions and comments that will be coming from colleagues online. But maybe with that, I'd like to turn to Nanette. Nanette, again, is Executive Director of ECOWEB in the Philippines. So Nanette, there is a very dynamic civil society in the Philippines. So from your position of leading one of these civil society organizations, what has been your experience in engaging on the AAP agenda? And what have been the main challenges that you think we should prioritize and address as a community? So over to you, please, Nanette.
Thank you, Mervat. And good afternoon, good day, everyone from the Philippines. Well, in our country, I could say there's already a high level commitment among civil society to accountability to the affected population. There are a number of approaches having been employed already by various organizations. And in our organization, ECOWEB and ClearNet, for example, we do promote the approach called Survivor and Community-Led Response to Crisis Approach, or we call SELR. And let me share briefly about this approach. So this approach is helping crisis-affected communities rapidly analyze their own situations, identify ideas and opportunities for holistic self-help. The approach recognizes that crisis-affected people are not victims, but survivors, and that communities are not homogeneous. They are women, men, younger, older, different ethnicities, religions with varying capacities, as well as vulnerabilities, with different levels of power, with capacities to all get involved. And this approach is helping crisis-affected communities to rapidly turn opportunities for increased self-help into action, like using rapid microgrants and other rapid capacity development, such as skills training and linking that transcend humanitarian and development divide. This ensures timely and relevant support to needs of the crisis affected through a process that strengthens their existing capacities. It is using local peer group or social mechanisms to maximize accountability. Accountability that is not only upward, but also downward and sideward accountability. It is using appropriate coordination also to ensure external actors to fill in the gaps, like, of course, government and other aid agencies, and to support the needs that cannot be met by this self-help mechanism. This is done as well by to empower also crisis-affected communities to link and represent themselves in engaging the government and other agencies. And finally, this approach also supports initiatives of self-help groups to initiate in finding durable solutions to their condition and address root causes of their vulnerability in a process that does not harm and thus ensures sensitivity to culture and context. After about 5 years of implementing this approach in different disaster contexts, we and other local organizations have already demonstrated, we could say that it works, and this is AAP in action. But despite the evidences, we and others have demonstrated, and it's not only ACLR, there are other approaches as well. But still, we could say that support for this kind of approach for scaling up and institutionalization is still limited. I wish to support the findings of ODI in their study that I see as a real challenge, and I would like to highlight the challenge of lack of dedicated multi-year funding beyond pilot approach, and somehow the lack of commitment to AAP by big funding agencies. The funding that we have mobilized so far or helped us implement the approach were still mainly from small agencies having more flexible systems. I would say that AAP agenda may only be realized if commitment to AAP is turned into concrete action and change in systems, practices, and mechanisms within major humanitarian players, especially among donors and international agencies. There are already initiatives on the ground that just need institutionalized support for scaling up. The humanitarian actors just need to listen to the people affected of crises and support more local actors already doing AAP on the ground. Thank you. Back to you, Mervat.
Huge thanks, Nanette, and thank you for, again, underscoring that there are good examples of AAP being conducted on the ground by local actors that need the spotlight, need the resourcing, and need to be scaled up. This is such an important point, and thank you so much again for highlighting the ACLR, if I'm not mistaken, the right acronym approach that's being taken or that you're applying in the Philippines through ECOWEB. And again, that critical point that you've raised around linking analysis, and I'm really revealing around how you allow, or you not allow, but you enable or you create the platform for affected people to rapidly analyze their own situation, and how you use this information to really tailor the specific response that is needed by affected people. So thank you for talking also about inclusion and diversity, which are also quite critical pillars with regards to AAP. So thanks again, Nanette. And with that, I'd like to turn to Emmanuel. Emmanuel, once again, is the Director for Health and Care at Ifrc. Welcome again, Emmanuel. So this past year has seen an unprecedented demand for community engagement across the world, largely in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Ifrc is specifically co-leading with WHO and UNICEF the risk communication and community engagement pillar of the COVID-19 response, in particular with this establishment of a collective service for Rcce, risk communication and community engagement coordination. So Emmanuel, it would be really good to know what you think are the key lessons from the past year that can benefit humanitarian and public health responses in the future. So especially in terms of rolling out the RCCE coordination approach, this collective service, what has been the primary, what are the main lessons learned that can inform future public health response efforts? And do you think that it can enable shifts towards greater accountability to affected people? So that's sort of linking that particular tool or approach to the larger agenda around AAP. So maybe with that, Emanuele, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mervat, and greetings from Geneva to all of you. Let me just start from the last words of Nanette that says we need to listen more. International organization need to listen more. I think the collective service was born last year on a series of failures over time to truly prioritize social accountability and engagement of communities during previous emergencies, and it was born on some failures that we had experienced in Ebola, for instance, in West Africa and in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And what we were living at the beginning of 2020 was, and we are still living, was a massive crisis of disinformation around COVID-19 that needed a response that would bring partners together, coherent to assess misinformation, but also to respond to what is underlying misinformation, which is trust, a lack of trust in institutions. So a number of organizations came together, WHO, UNICEF, and Ifrc, to build this collective service for risk communication and community engagement, bringing these two critical elements together to support a more coherent response around these two areas in COVID-19, with an initial focus on African countries, but clearly a global intention of operating. So the risk communication collective and community engagement collective service has been in place for a year, and I think we have a number of lessons that we have already learned. And first is that during emergencies you need to act fast, but you need to act locally, and we have learned this in a way that is very different. I think the times of organizations flying experts into context has been very much challenged. The response has been local and thankfully so, and very strong. It needs to be contextualized. We often talked also in Ebola, in the DRC, they need to be hyper-contextualized, in the sense that we really need to understand the communities and have, and communities may differ also within a few kilometers from each other. So this element of contextualization of the response, or hyper-contextualization, is absolutely critical. The second lessons learned is that we really need to break silences, and we need to break silences at various levels. We need to break institutional silences and bringing partners together. As we say, it's Ifrc, it's WHO, it's UNICEF, but the collective service has an ambition to go well beyond these agencies and bring in actors that are involved in risk communication and community engagement all over the world. And that's an important silence that needs to be broken. But also we need to break the silences between the health community that I somehow represent, the humanitarian community, the development community, and we need to speak a language that is similar when we talk about accountability, social accountability, community engagement, and risk communication, and adopt frameworks that can be similar, and accountability that can really be present across various sectors. Another important lesson then for me is a critical one, is that social and behavioral sciences, and allow me to be a little bit provocative here, are not fluffy sciences. They are absolutely core when you talk about epidemics and pandemics. For many years, we have seen the biomedical interventions coming down as the thing that will sort out issues. We saw in Ebola, we saw in COVID-19 that having a vaccine does not equal to vaccinate people. That you have vaccinations because people don't trust the institution, don't trust the politician, they don't trust the scientists, they don't trust the media. We have learned that mistrust costs lives, and we have seen it in attacks to Red Cross volunteers in Ebola, or we have seen it in people that are refusing to get vaccines because they don't believe in that. And bringing up the data about what is happening on the social side is critical. And the community, the Rcce collective service is really investing a lot in bringing evidence, bringing data, systematization, and visualization of the perception at the community level, so that we can work at the programmatic level on incorporating these perceptions and transforming into better programming that bring better results. And I think one element that needs to come into this is the consistent evaluation of the satisfaction of the people that we are trying to serve. They need to be driving the response, and we need to be able to assess better whether the services that are being provided are of good quality and meeting the needs. And I think 2020, and I'm concluding just with this point, has been a really a year of massive transformation that has brought this issue of localization and accountability at the very core of the work in health crisis, but well beyond of humanitarian workers. And this is something that will grow with time. And organization will be challenged on the way they really respond to the needs in a way that was not there, I think, before, and donors behind it will notice. So it's a massive wake-up call, and I think it's a moment, COVID-19, that can really move this agenda forward in a way that has not been happening before. And I hope that all together, and the collective service is one of the tools to that, we can move that in that direction. And I will put the link to the collective service in the chat if you want to have a look at the end of this discussion. Thank you very much, Mervat.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel, and thanks also for highlighting some of the benefits, and maybe this is the inappropriate word, but with COVID-19, this is an opportunity for us to work towards the transformative shifts and changes in AAP that we all desire. So thanks so much for talking to us about the Rcce, collective Rcce approach that UNICEF, Ifrc, and WHO are leading on. And as you've mentioned, this is for the system, and it's not just for the three organizations. And you've highlighted some really sobering also points around the importance of community trust. So a lack of trust in institutions or in science, or how we speak about the science, cost lives, and cost lives of vulnerable, cost lives of humanitarian workers that are the frontline serving vulnerable people. You also spoke about, again, striking that balance between acting fast, but also being accountable and acting locally. It's not either or, and it's not sequential. It can happen, and it should happen, at the same time. I also appreciate what you mentioned around the contextualization of the response. And again, that speaks honestly, bottom line, to the importance of localization. We will be context specific if we rely more and engage more with local actors, not only in terms of delivering humanitarian response, but really having a seat and having that meaningful engagement of local actors in decisions with affected people on what is best to meet the needs of populations on the ground. And then last but not least, that critical point around breaking silos. In the system, we've spoken a lot in the past around humanitarian development collaboration and linkages to peace. Of course, the COVID-19 response in the pandemic has really added a critical lens and an element on the importance of breaking the silos that you mentioned, Emmanuel, between health, humanitarian, and development, and other key actors, to make sure that we're joining up our efforts and force to act in a joined up and a coordinated and efficient manner. So thanks a lot again, Emmanuel, for these points. And with that, I'd like to turn to Kristen. Kristen Knudsen is the head of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs Office, OCHA's office in Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso is one of the countries demonstrating a strong commitment to and implementation of a collective AAP approach. So that's actually exciting, and there's a lot, I'm sure, to hear and learn from you, Kristen, on this. So you're charged with coordinating a response in a complex emergency. So it'd be great, Kristen, to hear your views on what have been the factors that are essential, or the main ingredients that are essential to make this happen, and what have been some of the obstacles that you were able to work around. So over to you, please, Kristen, with your thoughts.
Great. Thanks, Mervat. I hope you guys can hear me well. It's a pleasure to be here today and to have this opportunity to reflect on what we're trying to do and what we have been able to do and what we next need to do in Burkina Faso. I'll start by noting I'm not going to be able to go over the full context of our complex emergency this morning, but when I arrived in mid-2019, which was also the point at which OCHA opened our office here, the humanitarian community was really just coming into being. There was a hard press to really expedite a transition from previously quite stable development context to a humanitarian footing in what became, in the course of 2019, the fastest growing displacement crisis in the world, due to violence, insecurity, and the actions of non-state armed groups, where they were ongoing, and there was initial and immediate recognition of the value of community engagement and accountability work, but where they were ongoing, this work was quite diffuse. Organization-specific initiatives, I would say, predominated, particularly in terms of communicating with communities, using still C4D approaches, and also, I would say, a diagnosis that many of our partners were looking at prioritizing their corporate model to be rolled out, and we needed to look at more context-specific, context-appropriate work together. For instance, where we have gotten quite consistent feedback from communities across different mechanisms is that there is a strong preference for face-to-face feedback opportunities, and that technology-focused models are not particularly useful in context. Smartphones themselves can constitute a security risk for populations. There's high illiteracy, high technology illiteracy, and low access to technology, particularly in rural areas and amongst women, girls, marginalized groups. I think that one of our key facilitators from the beginning has been high-level engagement by the humanitarian coordinator and by heads of organization, if I can say so, by OCHA, to prioritize collective approaches to community engagement and accountability and start to tackle this idea of how do we build on what is already existent to create more complementarity and more coherence, and address weaknesses in the response. Not least among these weaknesses, the fact that international humanitarian partners promises and what we are delivering is simply not well understood, or was not well understood in a country by a government and by its people who were facing an unprecedented situation, didn't have familiarity with how the humanitarian machine works, but do have a strong, if increasing, incredibly recent as well, tradition of demanding accountability from their leadership. So we have that as one key facilitator. I would say a second key facilitator has been the fact that we have specifically looked at community engagement as a good in and of itself, as a commitment in delivering on our AAP global commitments, but also as a core component of our access strategy. In a very volatile environment, in the face of shrinking humanitarian space, with non-state actors targeting state efforts to provide basic services to the population, increasing community acceptance for humanitarian action based on engaging with communities to explain what we're doing, how we do it, and how the humanitarian principles are not concepts. They're actually rules of the road for better humanitarian action, for populations to have access to services, and for humanitarian partners to access populations. Early on, and with the support of key funding opportunities, such as the Humanitarian to Humanitarian Networks window of funding for collective approaches in common services, at the end of 2019, we were able to leverage some key partnerships for the humanitarian community. We got CDAC network to actually work with OCHA to put coordinator on the ground, a dedicated capacity for coordination on the ground from early in 2020, and to provide a consistent approach to our efforts to build the Community Engagement and Accountability Working Group. We also, and based on a very early interest and buy-in from the whole humanitarian country team, have built a partnership with specialist organizations like Ground Truth Solutions, who are conducting community perception surveys on satisfaction with the humanitarian response for us. And we've been able to layer in other common services. We have REACH working with us on multi-sectoral needs assessments, which have a broader national remit as opposed to the specific focus on affected communities of GTS. And so by looking at how the questions that they're asking can actually be coordinated from the outset, we've been able to enrich the feedback that we're collecting to inform analysis. We've also been able to really draw on other initiatives. And I think this speaks to what Oliver was saying about building on what's already there. And that common services are not enough to say collective approaches. We in 2020 had a significant amount of work in the context of the high-level panel on internal displacement with a lot of community focus group discussions. And we were able to draw in all of that feedback, but also use their mechanism for closing the loop to provide feedback to the communities about what we were hearing and what we were taking on board to inform the response. We're currently trying to do the same with the various community feedback mechanisms being supported by our equivalent of the camp coordination and camp management cluster. Looking at the framework that this has created for us with GTS support, not just in terms of doing the community perception surveys, but also a further engagement that they have made to support consolidated analysis of these various data streams to be able to have a richer understanding of what communities are actually saying to us. We've developed a set of AAP indicators that are in our HRP, but we've also got a common methodology now for continually analyzing and integrating into our periodic monitoring the feedback from communities. And then we have to keep moving and pressing into how we then are able to close that loop over and over in a consistent manner in terms of telling communities how we are actually responding to the feedback that they're providing. It's a lot of legwork. I noted that we are in a context where preference is face-to-face communication and no to low tech type modules. So we're also working at subnational level now to strengthen coordination and collective approaches to community-based agents and community-based networks as being means for communicating on behalf of us all with communities about our response. And I think we look ahead in the coming months, hopefully, to another pilot in West Africa, which is the rollout of the regionally hosted pooled fund and the country envelopes that we hope will include Burkina Faso in short order to make it possible to put more funding directly to local actors for accountability. These are core commitments of our financing management strategy that we're putting forward for the Burkina Faso country envelope of the RHPF. That should help us support collective approaches at that last mile in terms of closing the feedback loop and sustaining it. So quick overview, I hope comprehensible about our key facilitators, some of our key obstacles in terms of just the sheer manpower that we need to keep mobilizing for these support and approaches. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Kristen. And again, it's great to hear another, critical perspective, and hear the perspective of the UN and the role of the UN and the role of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in mobilizing that collective approach and response to AAP. So great to hear about how the organization is using the country-based pool funds at the local level, which are at the disposal of the humanitarian coordinator and a committee at the field level or operational level to determine how funds are being dispersed for the response. And it's good to know that AAP is one critical element that is being looked at and how these funds are going to be dispersed. I can also say for certain that at the global level, we're looking at specific criteria or indicators in the disbursement of country-based pool funds. If AAP is not built into these mechanisms, then it will be more challenging to disperse these funds, in the future. So it's good to know that it's already being rolled out, on the ground. Thanks for also highlighting the importance of multi-sectoral needs assessment, and how you've also capitalized or are looking at regular monitoring frameworks and how to look at the feedback being received to inform response and ensure that the corrective measures are in place to make sure that the response adjusts to the feedback that is being received. And again, reinforcing the point that came out also in the ODI report that Oliver spoke about, which is the leadership commitment. So with the humanitarian coordinator, the country representatives of UN agencies and NGOs that are part of the humanitarian country team and engaging with critical partners on the ground are absolutely essential. That leadership commitment at the country level, operation level, is absolutely important. So thanks so much again, Kristen, for the feedback and your intervention. Colleagues, we have a little over 20 minutes for questions and answers. I invite you, if you have any questions or comments, please do put them in the chat box. We already have a number that have come in, so maybe we'll just jump straight to this Q&A session, starting with a question to Nanette from Veronique. She is asking, Nanette, how in the survivor-led approach that you are implementing, how do you manage power dynamics in communities, patterns of exclusion and marginalization that exist in every community to ensure accountability is indeed for all, including where they may be entrenched social norms on gender, disability, or diverse sexual orientation? Perhaps, Nanette, this is a question for you, and while you consider the response, the next question is going to be for Vasiti, and it's a question from Ellie from TWB. Specifically to the context in Fiji. In a multilingual context like Fiji, there are some sections of the population who speak marginalized languages. They may struggle to understand information or make their needs and concerns known if there isn't specific provision. So it'd be interesting to know if language is a component of the inclusive approach you are integrating into policy and legislative reviews, Vasiti. So let's start with these two questions, and then we'll take it from here. Over to you, please, Nanette.
Thank you, Mervat, and thank you, Veronique. As I've mentioned, SLR approach is working with self-help groups in the community, and we consider that communities is not homogeneous, and that there are actually different groups in gender, and there is power dynamics, and thus actually the process really ensures that we provide opportunities for all. And so we work with existing and non-existing or new organizations or new groups, as the community so desires. So in our experience, for example, in some communities, like they decide that they would form like even 5, 7 to 10 groups. Like there is like a separate group for women, there is for farmers, there's for youth, and there's for men. And so it actually depends on the decision of the community and based also on their assessment of their needs. And so there are actually simultaneous actions being done by the community collectively and based on their decision. So it also based on context. So in indigenous peoples communities, for example, so they decide that it should be their traditional structure, but their traditional structure also ensures facilitates the inclusion of all and addressing the needs of everyone in the community. And we have seen that. And so we have to work with communities affected of crisis on site, and we have also worked with IDP, so displaced communities just known each other in their transitory shelter, but it works. So we have seen, although there are of course challenges, so this inclusion and exclusion issue, we are even saying through SLR approach, this kind of participatory approach, you are actually able to address this more effectively. And just would like also to mention that currently, we're actually conducting this localization dialogue with A4EP, OCHA, and Oxfam in the Philippines. And so one highlight actually with the focus group discussions with 25 communities affected of crisis, everybody actually expressed their first major recommendation is for humanitarian agencies to involve them in the planning, in the implementation, in the monitoring of the response and actions in the community. And this study we hope to share soon, and we're just like that. This is really like showing that people affected, they have actually capacities and they believe on their capacity. Thank you. I hope I have.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry,
still learning to find the buttons even after a year, doing this. Apologies. Many thanks again, Nanette, and just directly straight to Vasiti, please, on the question on the specific question on Fiji and speaking marginalized languages, two marginalized languages in Fiji before we move on, because I know we're very tight in time. We have a little over 15 minutes. So over to you, please, Vasiti.
Thank you very much. The simple answer to that question is yes. I'd like to also make stress the point of governance. So in the emergency structure that we have during peacetime, we've got the respective ministries responsible for communication as well as indigenous language that supports the NDMO to translate public advisory, translate messaging out to the community. Now, during a response, because everything is happening almost instantaneously, we have the support of our partners. We're fortunate that with us, we have CDAC in-house that assist us with the process of reaching out to translators to translate our situation report that advise the general public about the importance of the cyclone, when it's going to approach, and the response effort that the government is doing. So it's a two-way communication, and it's very, very important for us as disaster management to speak all language so that the communities are able to understand the message that's being pushed out, because our main agenda is saving lives. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vasiti. Perhaps with that, we'll go straight to Oliver. So Oliver, a couple of questions. One is, how do we align with our commitment to include affected populations in the design and management of collective RCCE processes? That's the first question. And while I have you, and as you have the floor, another question from Smruti. It'd be great to hear how the AAP feedback from affected people have changed decisions or changed the response in a timely way. Over to you, please, Oliver.
Thanks very much. Both really good questions. On the sort of local leadership and involving local actors in the design of collective approaches, I think we've already heard some fantastic examples from both Nanette and Vasiti. I'll limit this to how people are involved in designing the collective approach specifically, rather than the wider question of participation of affected communities in decision-making and responses, which is a much bigger and thornier issue. But I guess there are both technical and political answers to this question. And what can be done is really going to depend on the type of response, and especially kind of the strength of the host government, whether it's a government-led response or an internationalized response. But a few possible options. At a really basic level, it could involve making sure that you have a good information ecosystem assessment, that you incorporating questions on how people want to be communicated with and how they want to give feedback into your needs assessments. Another clear thing you can do is actually make sure that local organizations are in the lead of the facilitation processes for these collectives, even if it's a more internationalized response, that it's not necessarily always, Oxfam or UNICEF running community engagement working groups, but it is a local organization in charge of that. Also, especially when there's a lot of partnering going on, trying to think of creative ways to bring sort of partner networks into dialogue with a more internationalized humanitarian response, which really can exclude local actors. So there was a fantastic example in DRC of, I think it was Caritas, sort of holding consultations with their faith-based networks and then feeding that into kind of international dialogues and international forums. And I guess at a more political level, especially in contexts where you know, there's a strong natural hazard-related disaster management architecture of making sure that this really is a preparedness activity, and that the collective approach, you know, finds ways to make sure that, you know, it's part of disaster preparedness plans that involve, you know, people's elected representatives fundamentally, and are part of, you know, a wider system of representative governance. So that's kind of from small to very large steps. But I'll leave that question. And then Smriti's point, the point I wanted to add on that is there are a lot of examples, but it's quite fragmented. And one of the things I didn't bring up in the presentation is collective approaches where they function need to do a better job of M&E around what they're doing. So making sure that they're documenting examples of when decisions change, because it does happen, but it's really easy to get lost in the mix, and there is barely any funding or resources available for actually collective approaches to monitor themselves. And I'm not necessarily talking about monitoring kind of the ultimate impact on populations, because that's a wider response issue, and it's you know, causality is quite hard to prove. But being able to say, we brought this feedback in such a way that this decision was made, can be documented much more clearly. I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Oliver. I'm certain that we need actually, for a topic as rich and as important as this, and quite a diverse panel, we need another hour to cover all of the bases. But thank you for being brief and to the point. Maybe I'll turn now to Kristen Knudsen. A question from Veronique. One of the issues we had in the study on collective approaches to AAP at HPG was the lack of evidence of when collective approaches to AAP facilitate change in the humanitarian response. So any examples from Burkina Faso, Kristen, that you can share with us? And while I have you online, it would also be great to respond to another question. Response needs to adjust to feedback from the crisis-affected population. How do we ensure that projects don't deviate from donor targets or commitments, as this is usually one of the concerns of agencies? Any insights on this would be helpful. So over to you, please, Kristen.
Thanks, Mervat. Two very interesting questions. And I mean, I think I just want to start by really acknowledging Oliver's concluding point about we need to do a better job of documenting when we are and how we are actually changing decision making, to really make the case. You know, I'll try to cite a couple specific examples of where I'm seeing, and I would like to do a better job of really documenting that impact. But I think that we have where they've been rolled out in Burkina Faso, which doesn't have a lot of background in cash for humanitarian response, cash approaches to humanitarian response, but where they have been rolled out in urban settings in particular, there's this very strong preference for cash over in-kind support. 65% of respondents in urban settings said that they want cash-based assistance. In contrast, there's a larger preference or a slightly marked preference for in-kind in more rural areas, in harder to access areas, and frankly in areas where humanitarian operations are ongoing. So I think that we are trying to use that feedback as part of the analysis to justify and to then impulse or to provide an impulsion for more cash-based programming to think about how we can do it in a more multi-sectoral approach and how we can do it broader. And just to note that, you know, that is tied in, for example, to the cash for food assistance work that we are doing with funding from the Central Emergency Response Fund via WFP and some broader partnerships that they have established. So that's perhaps one example that I could cite. It's hard to say that, you know, the community feedback is the determinative element, but it's certainly a contributing element. And I think that's an important emphasis to continue to push forward. Another one, and this is less about the collective approach, but more about how committed agencies can really become influential by listening to accountability feedback. we've got examples about communities basically saying, you can come, communities in very hard to reach areas, saying to their humanitarian partners, you can come. It would be best if you come on day X to avoid the market or to be there at the time of the market. These are the, the transportation modalities or the transporters who can work in this area because they know the context. And also providing feedback on quality specifications for the assistance that they're going to receive to ensure that it doesn't make them a target. So, some strong complementarities with security analysis and considerations, do no harm considerations, but that are built on community feedback about what they feel is appropriate to support response. And so I think that that's another concrete example of what we need to continue to build on. Turning towards the second question, if I can also be a bit provocative, take my shot at that one. One of the things that I've observed and discussed with some partners, I won't name them, but they acknowledge the point, is that it feels in Burkina Faso that every organization, and in some cases, almost every program, has its own hotline. But, are we actually even really hearing the information that's coming from those hotlines? And I have had discussions with a number of partners who have conveyed what they feel is the practical impossibility of actually consolidating across hotlines and then being able to aggregate and use that data in an effective manner. It's one of the key challenges we are trying to tackle, but it's a big obstacle. And it's not helped by the fact that a lot of those hotlines are put in place because that's the AAP commitment, or that it's not the AAP commitment, that's the accountability commitment to the donor, because the donor has asked for there to be an AAP commitment, and this is kind of the minimum threshold. So I think we need to, rather than being concerned about how feedback changes targets we've promised to donors, we need to welcome feedback changing commitments we've made to donors, and to do that so that it's really making greater coherence come together in our approaches. Over.
Great, thanks, Kristen, and thanks for being provocative. Always welcome, and that's how we strive for change as a system. So maybe I'll direct the last question to Emmanuel from Ifrc. So Emmanuel, we have high levels of satisfaction emerging in the evaluations that are being conducted. It also may be because we are not doing enough community engagement to begin with, and people don't feel comfortable speaking up. So in your view, what needs to be done to address perhaps two things? One is addressing some of the existing trust deficit within communities, and how can we ensure that there is better access to community feedback and complaints mechanisms? Over to you, please, Emmanuel.
Thank you. Important question, and I think feedback mechanisms are very much cultural. They are cultural elements, they are language elements, they are literacy elements in it, but the critical element on responding is trust. And so who asks the question is important. And if you don't have trust in who's asking the question, you will not be inclined to give a truthful answer. And so for me, understanding at what level and how to engage is very important. From a Red Cross perspective, we work through volunteers that are selected within the communities where they come from, and they are trusted within those communities. Hence, the ability to ask questions and receive more truthful answers is clearly enhanced. That is different if you have a government official maybe coming in and asking questions directly. So I think, again, going contextualized, and it's extremely important in that way. And the other way is to make sure that whenever data are collected, then the feedback loop is closed with action taken. And that builds trust, because people see, oh, I've been listened to, people have acted. And I just wanted to give an example that for us was quite relevant. We the Red Cross was very involved in Ebola, in safe and dignified burials of people who had been dying of Ebola, and it was extremely difficult at the beginning to get people to accept these people coming in, our volunteers coming in with the hazmat suit, into the hats, taking all the body out, taking the belongings out, burning the belongings, and going away and bury the person. And they were fighting. I mean, we had our volunteers also attacked, but there were the number of sessions, many around feedback, that allow us to understand that people thought that we were taking away the soul of the people and putting stones in the bag, and that allow us to change the way the bag was manufactured and have it transparent on top, so that people could actually look inside, that we were not taking away the body, we're not putting stones in it. We had fears that the people, the relatives, were not feeling close to the deceased, and then we changed our approach by putting one of the relatives at least to be in the hazmat suit and be able to be close to the dead body and accompany really until the last point. These are some simple examples that can change the way we operate. And I would say one last thing that we learned really in the RC recently. Through the feedback monitoring systems, we knew that certain communities were not trusting their response, and we saw the lack of trust increasing over time. And when these reached the highest point is when we had attacks against facilities that led to the death of doctors and nurses that were working in that facility. That is also an issue. It is a tool that can help creating better safety also for the workers in highly highly tense environment. And so there is an element, additional elements that can come. And if we you can work on those tensions levels before you actually have moments. So that's once again why community engagement saves lives and is so important.
Great. Many thanks, Emmanuel, and huge really thanks to all of the other panelists for making the time to be here, and most importantly for all of the colleagues that were able to join us today. Again, please do feel free to forward the recording of the session with colleagues that were not able to join today, but perhaps a couple of very quick concluding remarks. And I wanted to first thank the panelists before colleagues hang up and run to the other meetings, because it's important to recognize the great interventions and the good responses that came from the panelists. So first is there's a lot of, as I was mentioning, there's a lot of good work happening within the system. We're all working towards the same objective. The ingredients for success in terms of achieving our collective responsibility to serve people in need are there. There are brilliant examples already on the ground in operations at the country level that we need to shed the spotlight on and scale up. And we are committed to make sure that we do more of that. In the world of the Interagency Standing Committee, there is a lot of critical building blocks that we are putting in place to make sure that we achieve this. Starting with, again, and it's huge thanks really to the co-chairmanship of UNICEF and UNHCR of the IASC's Results Group on Accountability and Inclusion. They are currently developing a collective accountability and inclusion framework to set out the core commitments and building blocks for humanitarian coordinators and humanitarian country teams. This will help HCs and HCTs to better implement collective AAP and be held accountable for doing so by setting out key actions that they will be devising themselves that are needed throughout the humanitarian program cycle, and look at metrics for success. Results Group 2 in the IASC is also working on developing a critical tool. We talked a lot about, again, Oliver, you're mentioning monitoring and evaluation, measuring progress. So there is an IASC results tracker that is being developed under the auspices of Result Group 2 within the IASC, and it's with huge thanks to CHS Alliance that is really leading the charge and the consultations within the community on developing this results tracker to monitor collective accountability and inclusion, and it will provide a strong roadmap on the minimum required steps and should be adopted as a standard. Again, between the accountability framework and the action plan that will be devised by HCs and HCTs, inshallah, as well as, again, the results tracker to look at the progress being made and the benchmarks. Systematically, we will be in a better place to make sure that we achieve on these AAP aspirations. A community feedback and complaints mechanisms, we didn't speak too much about it in today's session, but again, obviously critical, fundamental, at the core of the response, full stop. And by having strong community feedback and complaints mechanism, that are a key ingredients of which is trust, as colleagues have mentioned on the panel. Key ingredient is trust, accessibility by communities, trust communities to use them, and the analysis of, again, that feedback that comes in a secure environment, channeling the feedback to the appropriate platforms, decision makers, and adjusting responses accordingly is fundamental, and is an area that also the Interagency Standing Committee, through the work of the Results Group 2, is looking at. Last but not least, there is a service directory and AAP portal that was launched several weeks ago, with thanks again to RG2 and the IASC. The link will be put in the place in the chat box shortly. Take advantage of it. Great resources that will help us as a community to make sure that we deliver on our AAP commitments and aspirations. Again, huge thanks. Many more discussions to come, and I hope the next discussion will talk about, again, some of the good progress that we're able to make in this really fundamental aspects of the work that we do. Thanks so much again, colleagues, for a great session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bianco.